Hi, everybody. I'm Alma Marston, for those of you who don't know me. I have the pleasure of being here with Anne-Marie Slaughter today to talk about hope, renewal, and transformative resilience in what is turning out to be an extremely disruptive world that we're living in. Before I get started, let me introduce Anne-Marie. She's hugely impressive, as most of you will know, but Anne-Marie is the CEO of New America, a think tank in Washington, D.C. that focuses on American renewal and progress. She's a professor of international affairs at Princeton. From 2009 to 2011, Anne-Marie was the director of policy planning for the State Department. I love to be able to point out that she was the first woman to hold the position. Anne-Marie is also the author or has edited 8 different books. She has a new book coming in the next year on renewal, the topic that we'll discuss today. And these are just a few of her many accomplishments and accolades. So welcome. It's such a pleasure to be here with you, Anne-Marie.
It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
So we're revisiting a conversation, or jumping off from a conversation that we had a year ago. Last time you hosted me there in New America to talk about my book on transformative resilience. And it only felt fair to do the honors of getting to host you now, but also it feels very timely to revisit our conversations given how disruptive the world is and how much has changed in that year since we sat down together. So I wanted to get your input about renewal, where we are today and where we go from here. So let me start with a question for you. I've heard you talk about renewal and American renewal at what you see as a low point in our history. And I'm curious as to how you see the concept and how it overlaps with the notion of transformative resilience and using our challenges and adversity for growth and innovation.
There's a lot of overlap. The idea of renewal is in between reform and revolution. So if we think of a spectrum of change, reform takes what we're doing already and makes it better, reforms it, but you use the same materials you already have, you just put them together in a better way. And revolution is the other extreme, where you overturn it. You know, revolution really means revolve. So you overturn it completely and you put up something new. Renewal's in between. It is absolutely, or can be, I think, demands big change. So much more than just reform. But it falls short, or stops short, I should say, of revolution in that it's renewal. So it points backwards and forwards at the same time. The re points backwards and new points forwards, and you renew, you make something that exists new. And to do that, you actually have to generally tear down some of what's there. If you think of a renovation in a house, you tear down a lot of what is old or ugly or doesn't suit anymore. But you take the very best features, and sometimes that can mean, you know, scraping down to see what was an original floor or an original wall, or maybe you take a view and you expand it. You take the best things and you update them and you make them new again. And I think of that particularly in the concept of renewing your vows or renewing your best self, so that you, again, you take the best and you recognize that there are good things. That's an important piece of it. You don't just throw everything out. You say, no, there's things here to be preserved, but in a new form. So that's the kind of frame of renewal. It's very much connected to resilience and very much to transformative resilience, because as I conceive of it, renewal starts with radical honesty about your failings. And that can be a person, an organization, a country, but that you can't renew unless you're willing to look at what has been very, very honestly. And that requires resilience. And indeed, often, as has happened in my case, it's after a fall or a failure that you pick yourself up and you say, well, why did that happen? You find the courage to face things that you're embarrassed about or humiliated by or just don't want to admit. All of us have things we prefer to deny or look away from, and we face them squarely and we change them. And the things we can't change, we try to reframe or to build on differently. So resilience, I think, is a key part of it because it requires resilience to be honest, and because, again, renewal often follows failure. And that is what you write about in Transformative Resilience, where you can fail and either build back to where you were or build back better, to paraphrase Joe Biden's campaign, but it's a term that we've used in many other ways. So there's a deep connection.
You talk about radical honesty. I mean, are we in a moment of radical honesty? Do you think we're at that cusp of something new and, transforming? We have such challenges at our doorstep. I mean, California and the West, we're on fire. We have economic crisis linked to the lockdowns of the coronavirus. We have, racial tensions and the need for sweeping reform in race relations coming to light. I mean, is this that kind of moment, that sweet spot for being honest with ourselves? Are we there and are we doing it?
Well, if we're not, I can't imagine what more it could bring us there, because really the news seems apocalyptic. And if you are in California at the summer of 2020 and the fall of 2020, you are looking at heat waves and power shortages and towering infernos and a pandemic that people say you can't go outside because of the smoke in the air, and you can't stay inside because of the virus. And really, you look at these pictures and they look like Hollywood movies of an inferno, but it's not, it's reality. And that's just one example. So, that's just the natural, the virus and fires. And then on top of that, we are exposing systemic racism, certainly as never before in my lifetime. I would qualify that to say quickly to white people as never before. This is not new to people of color, but I do think the country is experiencing systemic racism not as a Black issue or an issue for people of color, for those directly affected, but as a national issue, that it is exposing us and exposing hypocrisy, lies, betrayal of the things that we say we stand for. So if we really stand for them, we cannot look away. So you add all of that, and yes, I hope this is a catalyst for transformative change.
I mean, that is certainly a lot to take on. And it doesn't, when you talk about it, you've used the word apocalyptic. This morning, there are pictures of California, San Francisco, where I used to live. The sky is orange. The virus is still spreading. And in the midst of that, it feels like a radical act to be hopeful. I mean, it almost feels sacrilegious to be hopeful. And yet, I am hopeful. I believe that you are as well. And I turn to the research of a psychologist named C.R. Snyder. And what's so interesting about what he said about hope is that, one, it's learned behavior. So that puts it within our reach because we can learn it even at these difficult moments. But for many people, it still feels too passive. It's like, what's hope going to do for me in the midst of this apocalyptic picture or really challenging picture? And the other thing that he says that I'm going to ask you about here is he talks about hope being very active and it being about the process of linking an imagined future to the present, and that you build upon it. It's not that you kind of hope and then sit back and kind of say, I hope the virus will go away, or, that it is active and you create a path to that. So I guess my question for you is, what role hope plays in transformation amidst what I see as, multiple policy failures and some real challenges?
That's such a wonderful way to think about hope. I was reading an article this morning that described an interview with Eddie Glaude, who's just written a wonderful book on James Baldwin, and he said, and he was quoting James Baldwin, "I'm not optimistic, but I am hopeful." And I think that is, again, yes, this idea that hope is not, oh, everything will be fine. It is, to hope is to see a path. And to see a path may mean to cut a path, to imagine it, to design it, to clear the obstacles, even if you know that path is hard and difficult and you may well not actually make it. Then that's where optimism and pessimism come. But without hope, I don't know how we get out of bed in the morning. And I think for many of us, and for those of us all, we are separate. We are in our little houses and we see our neighbors, if we're fortunate enough to have houses and neighbors and be in a place where we can go outside. We still feel deeply alone, many of us. And I think of it as hope is fighting despair. In other words, it's the act of saying, it just seems so dark and I don't recognize this country. The idea that, the Americans can't travel because we are addressing COVID so badly, and we are addressing COVID so badly because we have a dysfunctional democracy, a broken democracy, and because of systemic racism, because look at who is dying, and a totally dysfunctional healthcare system. You put those things together and you think we're the richest country in the world, and we have millions of cases and soon 200,000 people dead. I don't recognize the country, and yet to just give up seems itself a kind of betrayal. In other words, I think of hope as work, as insisting on believing even when you can't see the path, and yes, trying to clear it and trying to bend our energies toward it, because otherwise, yes, we're giving up, and we know nothing good comes of that.
I wonder if there's innovation linked to hope, because you can think about the status quo, and in a way staying stuck in that mindset where you're not hopeful makes you accept things in a negative light, or where they are, and there's always this challenge of what we do and don't control, a range of kind of what we control, what we influence, and what we don't control at all. And I think that's a huge challenge for so many of us right now, particularly being in a place where we have less control than we're used to feeling that we've had in our lifetime. But I wanted to talk a little bit about innovation as, a way of being hopeful, thinking that maybe something could be done differently in whatever arena you're working in. And I remember reading a piece that you wrote in the New York Times in March, and I walked away and I just thought, wow, that was fantastic. If only I could have said it that way. You were writing about the coronavirus and the response to the pandemic. and the fact that although there wasn't this unified national response in the way that we would want, that there was all this innovation taking place in leadership at different levels. What do you see as being most hopeful or most innovative in America right now? Or, whether it's at home or abroad, where do you see those pockets of hope that are kind of marching towards a new reality?
Well, I see lots of innovation. Let me start with where it's happening, and then we'll talk about what. What I wrote in March, and is even more true today, is that the ideal would have been a kind of collaborative federalism where the national government says, all right, this is why we have a national government. It's to marshal resources that are greater than any one of the parts can marshal alone. It's to exercise authority that spreads through the whole country. So you would have had a president who called together all the people necessary to make sure that we had all the personal protective equipment and all the tests, and that commandeered companies just as you would during a war to say we've got to manufacture all of this material, and then would have a centralized distribution system and would make sure that the states that needed the tests and the equipment and also a national strategy of testing and tracing and supported isolation, TTSI. We didn't have any of that. And that would have been the ideal, together with all the county health officers. I always thought a nacho was something you ate. I now know that nacho is the National Association of County Health Officers, and they are the people who are on the front lines, together with mayors, together with governors. You have seen a tremendous amount of taking charge, stepping in, recognizing that it's up to us. As a friend of mine said this morning, the cavalry isn't coming. It is up to us. I would have preferred to have a federal cavalry and local troops, but I still see a lot of innovation. And I also see these accelerated changes. Many of us have been saying for a decade that, of course, you could work from home. Many people could work from home part of the time, that was no reason you had to be in the office, and the demand that you had to be in the office all the time was privileging people who didn't have caregiving obligations or community obligations over those who did. And now, of course, yes, everyone sees not that you should work from home all the time. And of course, there are some jobs where you really can't at all, but many of those jobs are exactly the jobs that are most likely to be automated. We are moving to an economy where more and more people will have a digital component to their job. And that then allows much more flexibility, which in turn allows people to be who they need to be for their family, for their loved ones, for their community, whatever it is in their lives that requires flexibility, and still work. And then figuring out what supports that kind of work. So national, fast, affordable broadband, completely essential. Or in the education space, where again, without broadband, we can't educate people. But we've known that a traditional, expensive liberal arts education, which only 14% of Americans go to four-year liberal arts residential colleges anyway, that it's not that there's no place for that, and at its best, that kind of education can be spectacular, but it was never going to educate the millions of Americans who need to be educated for an economy that's constantly changing. And we're going to see a bunch of bankruptcies of traditional colleges and universities, but we're also going to see a dramatic expansion of online education and hybrid models. Or take community education. And here again, there are many communities experimenting with a model of K through 12 education that's part in the classroom and part in the community. And that can be at a museum, that can be at the fire station, that can be with libraries, but the education comes from many different places and ultimately will be more personalized. So those are just a few of the changes we're seeing where many people have been predicting them, but they required change of habit, which is very hard, as we know. And the pandemic has forced what could have taken decades of trying to change people's habits and suddenly said, you don't have any choice. You have to do it this way, which then opens up a whole new set of possibilities.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I want to ask you about within innovation is stuff like social safety nets. I think one of my fears about resilience is, and resilience in the traditional sense that it gets talked about so widely, is this notion that you can tell individuals that they have to be resilient and shoulder the burden of a broken system that's, you know, leaving them out on the streets. I'm thinking of the eviction crisis that's coming with people out of jobs, and just the fact that people aren't earning as well. And I'm curious about things like these experiments that are taking place to support a basic income floor, and the role that that plays in creating a transformation, and, you know, adding that transformational dimension of resilience. Do you have thoughts about that?
Do. Well, so a universal basic income is, again, another idea where pilots were starting, and we were on a path for probably a couple decades of trying to figure something out, where suddenly now there, I think, is growing recognition that we have to provide not just a safety net. I think of it as a social foundation. A safety net is this thing that catches you when you fall, and ours has always had lots of holes in it. It's never really been as comprehensive as many of us would like. But I think of this now very differently, that if we're going to have a thriving, prosperous society, and that means for everyone. Right now, we have a society where a very few people live very, very well, and many people are in real poverty, and everybody else is in precarity, right? That sense that they could be slipping. They are just one medical crisis away from having their mortgage foreclosed on or eviction. And then where are they? Because we have no way to catch them. And even what we have, unemployment, well, you had to be employed and you had to be earning enough. I mean, so I think of it as now rethinking what is the foundation we need to put in place to allow our people to thrive. Where do they, it's lifting them up, it's giving them a place to stand, and to be sure that that foundation will be there to support them as they try for things, and then as they fail, because they will try and fail. And something like a universal basic income, where you know you can only fall so far, right? You can fall, but you're not going to be on the streets. You're not, that actually enables risk taking and enables innovation. And there's been a lot of work on this, where it is precisely the people who are the most secure, who know that I can go take a startup, and if I fall flat on my face, my parents can take me in, and they've got enough income to do it, right? And you think about a lot of startups with their friends and family round. Those are people whose friends and family have enough to get them going. Creating that kind of foundation for all Americans would actually have the results of not dependency and the old ideas of welfare dependency. Quite the contrary. It would give people a foundation from which to reach for the stars, or to take risks, or to invest in themselves and others in ways that would pay off without the deep fear. As I said, there's poverty and there's precarity, but precarity is better than poverty, but that fear is paralyzing. And I think we're seeing that across the country, and it's causing a much bigger reassessment of what is needed than what had been, let's patch the safety net.
It's hard to know where to begin with some of this, and a lot of it takes vision and leadership and experimentation, as you say. I want to turn to the issue of women. It's something that you and I share in common, not just that we are women, but that we both have been advocates for women's advancement. And, I think through all of this disruption, what we've seen is that women have been some of the most effective leaders at the city level, the national level, and also at the international level. We've also just celebrated the 100-year anniversary of the right to vote for women. I'd like to point out that was the right for white women to vote. But, there are these markers of women's leadership success and advancement at the same time that coronavirus has brought a lot of setbacks with fewer women participating in the formal economy because of care. Violence against women has increased, attacks of women online. So this is, it's massive. It reaches across society. But I'm wondering if there is one place that you think we should focus to get women's advancement back on track. Is there kind of a linchpin in, making sure that women's advancement doesn't derail?
I don't know if there's only one linchpin. There is, the linchpin, as I think of it, is valuing care. It is saying that the work that women have traditionally done is just as important as the work that men have traditionally done, and that the work of caring for a family or for loved ones, and I define family very broadly, caring for community members is just as important as the work that brings in income. You can bring in income, but it just sits on the table as a pile of dollars unless someone converts it to actual care, to food, to shelter, to cleaning, to bathing, to dressing, all those things. But even more importantly, the investment in others. And right now, people, mostly mothers, are sitting there homeschooling their children. They're enabling their children to learn. And without that, those children cannot flourish any more than they can if they don't get food, or they don't get shelter, or they don't get clothing, and their basic needs met. And our society resolutely believes that dad's work is more important than mom's. And that just cannot continue. And on the one hand, we're at a time where we could see enormous progress for women, precisely as I said, because flexible work finally is there. And yet the women who should be able to take advantage of that are the ones who are stepping back because they cannot possibly be full-time teachers as well as full-time whatever they've been doing, and they're completely exhausted. And that is the women who have a choice about staying home. Then you look at the 40% of women in the United States who are the primary breadwinner, and they are doing both, right? And often their family supports are not there because they depended on parents, and often now, then you're worried about bringing the virus home to parents, or you are separately locked down, and so much of the cobbled together support system that women have relied on is now gone. And so that you can think of big public policy solutions, universal child care, paid family leave, elder care. But at the bottom, to find the political will necessary to do that, it has to be the recognition that this work is vital to a successful society. And I think about it, I'm a lawyer, my father's a lawyer, I've done it all. I've done the work that my father's done, and I've done the work that my mother has done. And honestly, the work of being there with your children, caring for others, which in our household, my husband has done more of than I have done, is every bit as important as my being able to bring in a paycheck. And that requires women who are leaders who just automatically assume those two things are equally important. As a leader of New America, if somebody tells me they've got a family issue, I say, absolutely, of course, that has to come first. And I would think less of you if it didn't come first. I think you have to tell me, you're my boss, I'm your boss, but if you said, nope, I've got trouble, but I'm just not going to pay attention to it, I would think less of you. So it's a mindset shift that I worry we're still a long way from, because it really requires women and men who have really done that work too, to be in charge.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's so much more to say, but I want to come full circle. Before you and I hopped online, we talked a little bit about juggling how many demands there are, which I think is particularly true for you these days, but for all of us. And come back to the idea of hope for each of us. One of the things that I've loved in you and I being connected these past couple of years is learning things like that you have a love of birds. I was always an absolutely terrible birder. I couldn't get my binoculars focused in time. But, nature for me is often my pressure valve, especially when I'm able to get out of the city, though parks, etc. And I'm just wondering how things like birding, how things like meditation, which I believe I've heard you say you do, what are the tools you use to kind of help balance, and what do they bring to your leadership? How do they allow you to show up in a different way as a leader?
Well, it's certainly true that nature as a whole is necessary to me, to be able to walk, to be able to observe the unfolding of a flower or a leaf. And you can do that in a city park or even a city street, as long as there's some nature there, although it makes me so aware of how critically important the creation of green space, of beauty, is in our lives. That for me is kind of touching the earth. It rejuvenates me, it renews me. And indeed, I have become an absolutely passionate birder. I was out last night at the end of 8 hours on Zoom. I took my binoculars and went out for 2 hours and immersed myself in trying to figure out whether a particular warbler was this kind of warbler or that. And my husband laughs at me, but it's a chance to be immersed in something else.
Yeah.
It's important as a leader because I know that my people need that time too, and I push them really hard to take time, to say you're going to be better at your job if you take real time. And I don't mean these kind of pseudo vacations, which of course, now that people can't go places in the same way, they say, well, I'm taking a vacation, and you say, well, what did you do? Well, I caught up, I did other work, I did the kind of work I don't have time for. Whereas really, being able to do something completely different is essential for our minds. As I say that, I am so aware as never before of the degree of privilege that allows me to say that. And it's almost like a ritual obeisance. I'm privileged and I recognize that I'm privileged. I'm just constantly aware now of what I and so many people like me take for granted, the ability to live in beauty, to have a house where I can walk outdoors and birds that I can go see. Although again, for those people who live in cities, Central Park is, yeah. You'd be amazed at how the places you can find birds, and all it takes is a pair of binoculars, but it takes time. And I'm just to go back to what you said, our society is reaching or has reached a breaking point. Mm-hmm. I am committed, as a matter of faith and conviction, maybe more than observation and prediction, that we will take this moment and make something better of it. Mm-hmm. But I am also aware as never before that we cannot continue this way, that we are asking human beings to live and shoulder burdens that are simply far too big for them. Mm-hmm. And it is up to all of us to find paths forward so that all of us have a measure of what the lucky ones among us as I said, have too often taken for granted. And that's resilience and transformation all in one.
That's such a nice, I think, place to wrap up, in recognizing the privilege that so many of us have and are coming to see in different ways through the coronavirus, through the kind of social upheaval and, you know, racial inequities being brought to light in different ways. The birding issue being one that got brought to light in, you know, terms of race and who can go be in nature and occupy those spaces. But I think you make a really important point about how we've pushed ourselves to the limits of living and working in a certain way, which just can't go on, because of the inequity, because of the way in which we're burning the candle at both ends, because of the privilege that it takes just to be able to find balance, you know, to find the space for that. And I see that as both being really challenging. You know, we have to really work to rise to the occasion, if, as you've said multiple times today, but also hopeful because it gives us choices. You know, there is a way in which many of us are having different kinds of realizations. And so I appreciate those thoughts. I find it very hopeful what you've said. I don't have hope that I'm going to become a good birder, but I have hope to be able to contribute in some small way.
You know, there are people who like to garden, there are people, you know, whatever it is. But I do think mostly what it is whatever it is that takes you out of yourself. So that, and meditation obviously is another way, but many of us, including me, spend so much time trying to tell my mind to stop going round and round and round, that looking at a bird does it more effectively than chanting or breathing.
Yeah. That's for another conversation. I'm the world's worst meditator, though I keep trying. Anne-Marie, thank you so much. I know that I've learned a lot today, that you've made me think, made me hopeful, and I know that other people will feel the same. So thank you, and I look forward to continuing our conversations.
Amma, you're welcome. It's really been a pleasure.
Take care.